All right, let's go to Saudi Arabia. So yesterday was September 11th. Obviously, it's a strange day. 20 something years onwards, because it's like, how do you think about it? Some people who watch our show, actually, a lot of people who watch our show weren't even alive whenever that happened, or they have no memory
Yeah.
of that, and it's difficult in order to think about it, in terms of the day itself. But what's not difficult is to assess the legacy, and I always actually like to think about September 12th, 2001, because that's the day that everything actually changed. That we are now, the 22nd anniversary of Paul Wolfowitz floating Iraq and Saddam Hussein in the Camp David meeting.
Yep.
So exactly, literally the day after 9/11, they were already planning on invading Iraq. You can go read about it if you're interested. And it's 22 years, I guess, on the date since we began covering up the role of the government of Saudi Arabia in this conflict. And our friend Glenn Klippenstein flagged this in one of the most disgusting displays that I've seen from the White House yet, where they openly praised Saudi Arabia on 9/11. This was the spokesperson, Adrienne Watson of the National Security Council. She says, quote, "We welcome this weekend's announcement by Saudi Arabia committing $20 billion to support President Biden's signature initiative, the Partnership for the Global Infrastructure." So even if they are funding said, global infrastructure, is 9/11 really the day that we should be praising the Saudis? As you flagged also, Krystal, the New York Times ran some bizarre agitprop. Let's put this up there, please, on the screen. A pro-Saudi normalization op-ed on 9/11, and did not even disclose that the writer works for a think tank, which is funded by the government of Saudi Arabia. And I mean, literally, the column itself is directly pushing for look, they're pushing for Saudi, Saudi normalization ties between the U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia. And I think that's a legitimate point of view. But, right there at the very top, a resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, lo and behold, where's that money come from? And then they have the gall to run it on 9/11, without any shame, without any mention. I just find this an exact run through of what's happened over the last 22 years, where we've erased the government of Saudi Arabia's role in this entire conflict, of their inability, or at least complicity, in order to stop this plot. Some say fund this plot. It's at least very aware of what was going on. We know, we had that gentleman on our show not that long ago who talked about how there was a confirmed, FBI informant in Saudi Arabia, Saudi national, who was interacting with two of the 9/11 hijackers before the entire plot happened. There's still so much to be said about their role with the Taliban and how deeply they were involved and knew of what bin Laden was doing. And then that doesn't even begin to scratch the surface. The Bush administration openly flying Saudi people out of the country and covering for their safety, at a time when 3,000 Americans were smoldering dead, and, at the Pentagon and at the World Trade Center and on United 93. So anyway, there's so much to say there, 20-something years on, in terms of what the impact has been. But I really think today is the anniversary I always look to in terms of the jump-off point for really where everything went wrong. The entire modern era that you and I are living in began that day, September 12th, 2001.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
listen, it's been said many times, so it's worth saying again, if we did absolutely nothing in response to 9/11, it would have been
Yeah, it might have been
far,
better off.
far superior than what we ended up doing, which has been a, complete calamity, obviously, for our men and women who served and were injured and died and, still suffer PTSD to this day. The rates of veteran suicide are absolutely a tragedy and really a moral stain, I would say, on the country. That's to say nothing of the, unbelievable toll on Iraqi civilians and civilians throughout the Middle East. So the way that we, upended an entire region with complete disastrous results, the amount of money, I mean, this is like the least of the problems, but the amount of money that was spent there when we could have been investing in things that would have helped people here instead of just murdering people and creating chaos. But, on that, I think it's worth spending one more minute on that Adam Johnson piece, which flagged the Saudi propaganda in the New York Times, because he had a really good paragraph in his Substack write-up here. He says, listen, laundering influence through think tanks is but one way the Saudi government attempts to influence the U.S. public and lawmakers. He goes through, Saudi funding of Vice News that led that company to pull punches on their coverage, including removing a documentary critical of MBS from its YouTube page. They are the second largest investor in Twitter, helping Saudi authorities gain favorable treatment, jailing or executing regime critics. Saudi Arabia is now a major player in Silicon Valley and Hollywood and the DC lobbying world. But, he says, Nothing quite has the subtle and respectable impact of a well-placed think tank op-ed in the English-speaking world's most influential newspaper. The pretense of academic credibility, the serious foreign policy person prose, the inability for even the most skeptical observer to know who is footing the bill for the writer in question. If the Times wants to publish writers commenting on Saudi affairs who are backed by the Saudi regime on 9/11, no less, that's their prerogative, but if they do so, they should at the very least let readers know about the glaring conflict of interest at work, because obviously that would inform how you read this piece. So yes, this could be a completely legitimate perspective, one point of view that this individual is sharing, but it matters that you know who this person is being paid by and why they might hold that view.
Yeah, of course it matters. It matters a lot. And especially, again, the paper of record. And, for the Times, this is still the worst media screw up of our entire lifetime, of
Yeah.
which, look, we got a little bit of accountability, but we didn't get nearly enough. This is the New York Times. They basically helped drive us into the war in Iraq with their ridiculous Judy Miller coverage of yellow cake uranium. But even post 9/11, there's a lot still to be said. Glenn Greenwald has done some incredible work. I still recommend people go and look at it in terms of how the media dropped the ball on the anthrax crisis and then end up using anthrax in order to manufacture consent for even more like WMD freakout, which led to the invasion of Iraq. It is the single most insane period of our entire lifetime. And if you weren't alive at that time, or if you were too young to remember, I was really on the cusp. I've really only read more about the most insane parts, but at least, cognizant enough to remember the day that we invaded Iraq. And even at the time, just being like, this is crazy, this is nuts, in order to watch this. And then the subsequent fallout, you're talking about so many people we know who've been, injured or wounded in combat or came back and never felt the same. This is the reality, I think, of the fallout. It's also funny because I was flagging for our team. We tried our best to find some of these ads, but we weren't able to. Put this up there. I always like to try and remind people. The government of Saudi Arabia spent billions of dollars on U.S. ad campaigns in terms of like television ads across 19 different cities and including on radio to try and prove that they had nothing to do with 9/11 and to say they'd been a loyal ally. Here's a hilarious report. August 17th, 2004. Saudis use 9/11 report in their U.S. ad campaign. Quote, stung by criticism about its role in fighting terrorism, Saudi Arabia has launched radio advertising in 19 cities, citing the September 11 Commission report as proof that it has been a loyal ally in the fight against al-Qaeda. What they failed to mention, obviously, is that there were secret pages withheld from the report, which directly discussed how a Saudi national and likely intelligence agent almost certainly knew of the plot for 9/11 and at the very least had reported some of this back to Riyadh. That wasn't even declassified until a couple of years ago, Krystal. So, just to think about how we use the 9/11 Commission report, which has all sorts of problems, and then it directly covered up the Saudi role inside said report. And they used that to spend billions of dollars trying to, rebuild their image. This is why, we freak out so much about Live Golf and all the stuff that was going on there, or even Saudi connection, because at the basic level, this government is the most responsible for one of the worst attacks on our soil since freaking Pearl Harbor, and they got away with it scot-free. The Japanese, you could at least say they got paid back for what they did. This, nothing. Most of the people who are responsible, they're sitting pretty, they're multi-billionaires, and they're hanging out in Riyadh today. Yeah.
All of the Biden administration's rhetoric about human rights and democracy, it just, our uncritical support of Saudi Arabia and Israel, I should add, it just makes a mockery of any idea that those values are really at the core of what the Biden administration is up to. Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.